Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of The Itch. This will be Part 3, Chapter 3. Not for the first time, Aizawa wondered if he was making the right choice here. It didn't really matter that Midoriya gave him a convincing argument of needing to move on and get stronger and that being treated with baby gloves wasn't going to do anyone any favors. Something was just rubbing Aizawa the wrong way. It came to a head when everyone was crowded around to wait for the time to go, and Midoriya was dropped off by his mother rather than coming himself, in order for her to speak to Aizawa and Inui privately. "I really didn't want him to go," she said, glancing back at her son, who was putting his bag in the luggage carrier. "Especially when his old habit came up again." Aizawa frowned, looking closer and seeing that Midoriya had some bandages peeking up from his collar. "Habit?" Inko wrung her hands tightly. "When he was little, he used to scratch," she replied. "It wasn't from bug bites or allergies, since he has none. He told me he was fine, but he always seemed to be anxious whenever it happened," she sighed. "He switched from scratching to mumbling when he got older, but now—" Inui nodded to himself. "Excoriation is common with anxiety," he said, "but at the level where he needs bandages for it is something to look out for. I'll keep track of him when he scratches and how badly." A soft growl rumbled from his throat. "As well as keep Bakugo away from him." He'd already been privy to the exam footage and was less than pleased about it. Far too many children had come from abusive households and brought their baggage with them to UA. He was already trying to work with Todoroki and avoid hunting Endeavor down like a hound, but any personal witness of abuse from him to Midoriya, and he probably wouldn't be able to hold his attack instincts back. Aizawa rounded the kids up for the bus, instructing Midoriya to sit in the front next to Inui with Bakugo in the back, working his way through assigned seating to balance out a little less suspicion before the 2-hour road trip was well on its way. Midoriya didn't say much and mostly stared out the window, the tilt of his head making his bandages stick out more and put a knot in Aizawa's gut. Inui's nose twitching let him know that the boy's scratch wounds weren't healed all the way either, the two sharing a look before letting it be and tuning out 1A's rowdiness, letting them get it out of their system before things really took off. Everyone filed off the bus at the drop-off point, and Aizawa held Midoriya back from the others, lowering his voice. "Stay on the bus," he said, leaving no room for argument. Midoriya just nodded and peered out the window at everyone as a car drove up and 2 members of the Wild Wild Pussycats got out for introductions. After some talk, his class suddenly ran back for the bus, only to be thrown back by Pixie Bob's Earthflow quirk. Aizawa gestured for Midoriya to come off of the bus. "The first task would be to get through the forest and its obstacles," he said, "but without instructor's help. We'll be going on ahead and getting things set up for everyone." Midoriya nodded, looking just a little sore at having missed a good start to the day, but saying nothing as he got back on the bus for the ride to the camp placement. He was given the specifics of the time to spend in the training. When everyone made it back, they would be given a starter feast and time in the hot springs before bed, and then in the morning they would be training their quirks. "For you, though, you'll be training your body," Aizawa said. "You have a good handle on what it does, just not being strong enough to wield it." Midoriya nodded his understanding and took to observing the forested area, looking oddly interested in the small mountainside in the distance. The initial start to all of it could have gone better. Midoriya arrived, said his hellos and asked what it was he needed to do, and even tried to introduce himself to Mandalay's nephew, Kota. Aizawa only saw a spark of violence in the young boy's eyes before his hand swung out on reflex to snap his capture weapon around the boy's wrist, keeping him from striking Midoriya. Midoriya, inside. His student just flushed with embarrassment and hurried in with Inui as Aizawa drew his capture weapon back in, giving Kota his patented, "Do it again and you'll have detention for a month" glare, and turning to Mandalay. "I can instruct Midoriya to stay away from Kota, but regardless of how old he is, I won't have anyone putting hands on Midoriya with ill intent here, understood?" Mandalay nodded and shooed Kota to the kitchen as Pixie Bob shook her head quietly. "How bad was it?" she asked softly. "Bad," Aizawa said. "Enough so that if Bakugo does anything else of the sort again, I'll expel him. Midoriya's mental state is far too in the realm of unknown right now for a repeat of what happened at the exam, and we're waiting on the clearance for a good psychology quirk user to see him. We're too uncertain as to what the stress of essentially being punished for something he doesn't recall would do to him, too. So, individual work for him, and keeping him separated from Bakugo," Pixie Bob said. "Anything else?" "Hound Dog will keep watch for any sign of heightened anxiety and figure out key factors," Aizawa replied. "He'll also help keep Bakugo away and make sure Tiger isn't pressing too hard." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Midoriya is strong and trying to stay positive here. But while his physical health is important to his studies, his mental health takes priority. Pixie Bob nodded. Fair enough, she said. Midoriya made himself scarce as his classmates filed in looking exhausted and starving. For the past hour, he already assisted the pussycats with cooking, setting up the rooms, and making sure the hot spring stalls were stocked before taking an early dinner and retiring back to the teacher's room. The lack of fuss he was putting up gave Aizawa a bit of worry. He fully expected Midoriya to beg to eat or take a hot springs bath with his friends, but instead the boy was lapsing into antisocial behavior and making himself as scarce as possible. He didn't ever seem to have any friends, and was too easy to lose in a crowd because he kept blending in so he wouldn't be seen, Inko had told him. Inui paired that with going back to a former anxious habit and concluded that Midoriya was probably regressing from trauma. Pairing that with the ticking time bomb of psychosis didn't fare well for Midoriya in the long run. Getting through this week as painlessly as possible was the goal before they could return to UA and arrange some in-depth help for Midoriya. Regardless of how much easier things would be, with Midoriya distancing himself and keeping close to the teachers, Aizawa knew it wasn't healthy. Solitude would be leaving Midoriya with his own head too much. And who knew how that would turn out? After the rest of 1A was fed and bathed, Aizawa pulled Ida aside to both check on him and get a good gauge of the class's reactions to Midoriya. We did extend an invitation to go shopping, Ida admitted. Although in hindsight, one of us should have stayed with him. Barely a half hour had passed before we all got a group text saying he wasn't feeling well and decided to head back home. Aizawa frowned, not liking that he hadn't been informed of this from the start. Who was last seen with him? Uraraka, but she said she lost sight of him after going to get bug spray. Ida didn't look any more convinced of that argument as Aizawa felt. I realize now that perhaps going on such a crowded errand was not the best form, especially if anxiety is a primary factor here. One factor, not primary, Aizawa corrected, rubbing his eyes. And are you all right? No scars after Recovery Girl tended to me, Ida said. I was mostly scared. His eyes shifted to the side, his expression troubled. Ida? The boy winced, unconsciously rubbing his arm where he had been stabbed through. It's just... I saw his face for only a second before I was blinded by his attack. I feel terrible for saying this, but I saw the same insane bloodlust that I saw on Stain's face back in Hosu. His shoulders shook with visible shudder. It's why I found myself unable to really defend myself, if that makes sense. Aizawa didn't like that additional insinuation of Ida being reminded of Stain of all people when confronted with Midoriya. But in the moment in the exam footage, just as Midoriya was attacking Ida, there was a split second of absolute, unbridled rage before the boy began screaming his head off in his attack frenzy. That wasn't anxiety. That was pent-up, hateful fury unleashed after years of abuse. It was mostly discerning at how someone like Midoriya could even feel and hold on to a dark emotion like that for so long, and for it to fester to the point where Ida had been reminded of the hero killer's bloodlust. The footage indeed did seem to show Midoriya attacking Ida with full intent to maim and even kill if need be. It would make sense, then, that Midoriya would repress any recollection or memory of having done that, if he felt it so out of his element to think, feel, or do. It makes sense, he told his student. Thank you, Ida. And how are the others faring? Ida looked thoughtful for a moment. Todoroki asked me if I was okay first, he said. He also asked me to please not hold Midoriya in contempt because he was not being himself when it happened. No one else really wants to talk about it. We don't really know what to say. Aizawa nodded quietly. Thank you. Get to bed. We have an early start tomorrow. Ida nodded and hurried off to wrangle the boys into going to sleep. He then sighed and headed to the teacher's room to wind down and get his extra lesson plan together for the remedial students. Midoriya was in his corner on his futon, curled up under a blanket and not moving. Inui gave Aizawa a nod. He's asleep, he said softly. Good, Aizawa murmured back. I'll give him his schedule tomorrow. He sat back in his own corner to get paperwork ready for Vlad to look over in the morning and allowed himself the brief moment of peace before the happy fun time hell began tomorrow morning. Breakfast came first, with Midoriya sitting at the end of a table eating in silence. After the fact, Aizawa led them out to a clearing where he handed Bakugo the same distance reading ball from the quirk assessment test and told him to throw it again. Everyone was shocked when they saw he only improved by maybe a meter. The aim of this training camp was to push everyone's quirk limits past what they thought was possible, something that was normally saved for second years. The arrival of the other two pussycats to aid in everyone's training, plus everyone receiving their personalized training schedules, definitely made everyone reconsider their life choices up to this point. Training methods were pretty extreme for the most part, such as Bakugo dunking his hands in boiling water and expanding his sweat glands. And they were well into their day when 1B showed up to begin their own training under Vlad King's supervision. Midoriya was paired back with others whose quirk focused on physical strength, presided over by Tiger with Hound Dog on standby for Midoriya's sake. As long as he wasn't being hassled or touched, Midoriya went through his grueling exercises in silence. It was an hour later that both Tiger and Inui noticed that Midoriya would sometimes lose focus, faltering for a moment before going back to his training. It took a while and some observation that Midoriya would falter whenever he heard an explosion and loud cursing from Bakugo, who was a quarter-kilometer away. We could give him some special earphones that cancel noise while having Mandalay give him directions, Inui suggested to Aizawa, who thought about it before nodding. All right, he said. I'll ask Yaoyorozu. He went and procured the headphones from his student before going back to where Midoriya was waiting behind the building compound, and then suddenly felt himself pause. Midoriya was staring idly at the small mountain in the distance, eyes unfocused as he absently scratched at his neck, paying no heed to anything around him. The sight made Aizawa's right elbow burn, flashes of USJ flickering through his peripheral before he shook it off. Now was not the time to be comparing Midoriya to Shigaraki. He handed over the earphones and explained off the expectation, and Midoriya nodded, smiling a little in thanks before tugging them on and getting back to the exercises that Tiger scheduled for him. Aizawa observed for a few minutes before turning to go make notes on his other students, pushing the incident out of his mind. As the day came to a close, Ragdoll told everyone to close out the day by making a communal meal for themselves, all from scratch. That included breaking the firewood, making the fire, and cooking the food from scratch as well. Exhausted as they were, Kirishima and Midoriya broke the firewood with their own quirks while Todoroki and Yaoyorozu lit the fires, and everyone else got to cooking, making up a curry together. Midoriya stuck by himself, as he had for the day, busying up with setting the tables and carting away dishes to clean as soon as they were finished being used, and looked up as he saw Kota trudging off into the woods toward the mountain. After the food was cooked and set out, he grabbed a spare plate and made his way off after the younger boy. The way up the mountain was simple enough to find once he spotted it, and he saw Kota look up once he got close enough, glaring at him. "How did you get here?" Kota demanded. "I followed you," Midoriya replied with a shrug, putting the plate of curry and rice down. "Well, get lost," Kota snapped. "This is my secret base, and you're not invited." He turned from Midoriya, scowling. "All that crap about improving your quirks, what's the point if you're just going to die anyway? It's just to have something to brag about." He didn't hear anything, and turned to see Midoriya sitting on the ledge of the cliffside, staring out at the forest and lightly scratching his chest. "If you have something to say, then say it already before I kick you over the side." Midoriya scratched harder. "Wouldn't be the first time I've been told to just fall somewhere and die," he replied listlessly, sounding far away. "Probably won't be the last either, though it's hard to say which route would be worse, dying from a fall this high, or having my skull crushed in by a villain." Kota leaned back a little, picking up a tone definitely more grave than he was used to. "What?" "You're so lucky you have a group of heroes to look out for you, whether you have a powerful quirk or any at all," Midoriya continued. "Better than being told how weak, useless, worthless you are, than being so ready to die at any given moment with only one little thing keeping you hooked on the lifeline." His scratching continued through his speaking, fingertips curled in to avoid hurting himself too much. "So when you finally have a grasp on some semblance of power, something that gives you some strength, some use, some worth, wouldn't you want to make sure you're the best with it?" He glanced over at Kota, green eyes dull. "It has nothing to do with heroes or villains. This is my power now. And whether or not I die a hero using it or not isn't any of your business or anyone else's. The only stupid thing I can see anyone doing is going down without a fight." He forced his hands away from his chest before standing up, staring down the mountainside. "Yeah, we'll die anyway. Everyone does. But if you want to die so badly, why wait?" He crouched down and took a flying leap off of the cliff, hearing Kota yelp in shock above him as he activated One for All and caught his landing in the trees before climbing down and making his way back to camp. He hoped Kota ate, at least. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 3 of The Itch. Chapter 4 will be next. Let me know your all's thoughts and reactions to this fic so far, and as always, Thank you so much for listening.